Hi class, I thought today I would read you our story of the week instead of just videoing it for you to see it so that you could see my face. I'm hoping that you are keeping warm inside your house and hopefully you've got to go out and play in this wonderful snow that's all outside. This week's story is The Story He Tells, and we're going to get our book out here in a minute. If you don't have your book, you can pause it and go get your reading book. We're going to look at the vocabulary. There's 4 words in this story this week. We'll see the word ashamed. So when you are ashamed, you feel bad about something you have done. So this dog looks ashamed when he knocked over the trash. If you worked hard, you should not feel ashamed. The next word is elders. Elders are people who are older than you. I enjoy listening to and learning from my elders. In my family, grandparents are the elders. There's the elders. Overflowing. The water in the glass is overflowing, so it's going over. Sometimes we have pencils in our pencil box and they're overflowing out of the pencil box, meaning they're falling out. That's what overflowing means. And pride. When you feel pride, you are pleased about something you did well. Kayla took pride in cleaning up the park. I feel pride about your great work today that you're going to do or you have done. So I want you to turn to page 64 in your book, and it's called The Story He Tells. The Story of Joseph Bruchac by James Bruchac. That's interesting that they have the same last name. Hopefully we're going to figure out who James Bruchac is when he's telling the story of Joseph Bruchac. So in this story, we're going to talk a little bit about making inferences, and we've seen this before. When you make inferences, you use clues to make a smart guess about something the author doesn't tell you. And you need 2 things to make an inference. One is the text or the pictures in the story, and the other one is what you already know in your brain. Do you remember what that was called? We've said this word so many times. What is that called, what you already know in your brain? Your schema. That's right. If you said schema, you're correct. So the words and the pictures in the book plus our schema, what we already know in our head, helps make an inference. So we're going to read through this story together. So you open up your book. We're going to go to the first page, but I'm going to let you look at your book while I read it, so I'm not holding it up. Joseph Bruchac III was born on October 16th, 1942. He was born in Saratoga Springs, New York. His parents' names were Joseph Jr. and Marion Flora Bowman. Joseph grew up in Greenfield Center, New York. That is in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. So this picture is of him in 2nd grade, like you're in 2nd grade. Joseph was raised by his mother's parents. His grandfather was an Abenaki Indian. He had a strong love for animals and nature. His grandmother was one of the first women to ever graduate from Albany Law School. She liked books and learning. Albany Law School, that's what this picture is. So who do you think are the most important people, using your schema and what we've already read in this story, who do you think are the most important people in Joseph's life? So he wasn't raised by his parents, he was raised by his mother's parents. So his grandma and grandpa were his most important, we can say, because he lived with them, right? So those are probably the most important people in his life. What do you think that Joseph might have learned from them? What do you think Joseph might have learned from his grandma and grandpa? Well, it says that his grandmother loved books and learning, so maybe he learned to love books and learning like his grandma. And his grandfather loved animals and nature, so maybe we can use our schema and what the words say to know that he liked animals, nature, books, and learning, because that is what his grandparents liked. Joseph's grandparents ran a small general store and gas station right next to the house where he grew up. The store was one of the main roads into the Adirondack Mountains. As a boy, Joseph loved to hear all of the stories and tall tales told by the people who came into the store. So here's his store. Now, using our schema and what we see in this picture, remember sometimes we use our pictures and our schema to make inferences. Do you think he lived in a big city? I don't think so. For one, that road looks like a small little road, and I don't see a lot of buildings. I see trees and grass all around their store. So this tells me that he probably lived in the country. That's what I'm thinking. That's where he grew up, was in the country, or a very small town. There were not many children out in the country where Joseph lived, so now it's telling us that he lived in the country. So we were correct. Because of this, he often played by himself in the forest. Sometimes he would walk by Grandpa Jesse's side. Grandpa Jesse taught Joseph a lot about animals, nature, and gardening. He never spoke much about his Native American background. Remember, another word for Indians is Native American. Grandpa Jesse and his family and other Native Americans had been treated badly. So there's his grandpa. So I read that Joseph often played by himself in the forest because not many children lived nearby. I also read that Joseph's grandfather taught him about animals and nature. That tells me that when Joseph played by himself in the forest, he was in a place he probably liked to be. Using my schema, if you learn to love nature, you probably like to be in the forest. And when I was a little kid, using my schema, I liked to make up things. I like to have an imagination when I was out playing outside. So I bet he used his imagination to come up with all kinds of stories. Grandpa Jesse said he left school when he was in 4th grade. Why? He was being called mean names. Hearing such family stories made Joseph feel sad. It also made him want to learn more. He wanted to learn the stories and traditions his grandfather was too ashamed to share. There's that word ashamed. Remember, something that you're not proud of. Joseph's grandmother passed on to him a love of school, and with this, Joseph went to college at Cornell University. While in college, he began to learn everything he could learn about Native American ways and beliefs. And as an adult, Joseph traveled the country meeting Native American elders. Remember, elders are the older people in the community. So these are the older people in their Native American tribe. These elders gladly shared their stories and traditions with him. So there's the school he went to. So why do you think that his grandpa Jesse was being called mean names? Why do you think? Well, we read that his grandfather was too ashamed to share stories and in tradition. And I know that Joseph's grandfather was an Abenaki Indian. So I think that maybe Grandpa Jesse may have been called mean names because he was different than everyone else, because he was an American Indian. So maybe they didn't like him, and that's why they called him mean names, because he was different. And we've been talking about how difference doesn't matter, right? We're all different. If we were all the same, it would be so boring. But that's not how it was when his grandfather grew up. When his grandfather grew up, they called him mean names because he was different. So how did Joseph feel about what happened to his grandpa? What did the story say? He felt sad, and it made him want to learn more because he liked to learn, and that's what he learned when he went to college. Joseph and his wife Carol met in college. They married and had 2 sons named James and Jesse. Joseph was overflowing with stories that he could often tell to his 2 sons. So all those things he learned in college about the Native Americans, he learned all those traditions and those stories, and he just couldn't wait to tell his sons. And before long, Joseph began to share the stories with others outside the family. Times had changed a lot since Grandpa Jesse left school. Now when Joseph told the stories, people listened and they were interested. They felt Joseph's retelling was important. They respected him. Joseph also began to write stories and books. So there he is sharing his stories. In just a few years, Joseph Bruchac became known all across the world as a Native American storyteller. He won many awards for his storytelling. Joseph has also written more than 120 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. Most of the books are about Native Americans. So here he is connecting with the audience around the world. Do you notice something in these pictures here? There's 2 kind of pictures in this story. One is a real photograph that helps us learn more about his life, Joseph's life, and the other one is an illustration, a drawing. And I think, with my schema, that maybe they did that because, remember, the name of the story is the story he tells. So maybe the illustrations are about his stories that he tells, and the pictures or photographs help us understand his life, because this is his biography. Growing up learning about Native American traditions, James and Jesse are also storytellers. So Joseph has a son named James and a son named Jesse. Joseph's oldest son, James, is also a wilderness and tracking expert. His younger son, Jesse, teaches the Abenaki language. So he teaches the language of his grandfather's Native American tribe. Now, notice the names of his sons, James and Jesse. What was his grandpa's name? It was Jesse. So he named one of his sons Jesse, after his grandpa. That's how much he loved his grandpa. And then if you go back to the very beginning of this story, do you remember who wrote the story? Let's look back. I have to find it. Joseph Bruchac. The story of Joseph Bruchac, written by James Bruchac. That's his other son. He had two sons named Jesse and James. So James wrote this story about his dad. Isn't that pretty cool? So there it is, James at work, right there. And there is Jesse, James, and there's Joseph in a picture. There's him and his two sons. Joseph still lives in the house where he grew up. He writes and shares stories almost every day. He takes extra pride in seeing a love for stories continue to his grandkids. He and his sons continue to help pass along these once hidden traditions to future generations. So there's his grandchildren. There's Joseph and his grandchildren. Now you see the word pride. And do you remember the word that his grandpa had for his stories? Joseph says he has pride in the stories, but his grandpa Jesse was ashamed of those stories. Those are kind of opposites, ashamed and pride. Ashamed means you're not happy with what you did, and pride means you are happy with what you did. So his grandpa, because he'd been made fun of, was ashamed of all those stories. However, Joseph, when he grew up, decided he had lots of pride in those stories, and he actually made a career of it by writing stories and sharing those stories with everyone in the world, and his grandchildren, and his sons. So after we get done with this video, one of your things to do today is to look at those 4 vocabulary words: elders, overflowing, ashamed, and pride. And right here, you're putting them in alphabetical order. You're not just rewriting them. You're putting them in alphabetical order. And then underneath here, you're not just writing what you think they mean. Do you remember we go to the back of our book and what's called do you remember what it's called? It's called the glossary. Remember the glossary? In the back of the book, it goes in alphabetical order. Glossary is another word for dictionary. And you're going to find the first word is elders. So it's going to be an E. You've done this many times. There's elders. And you're going to only write what's in black. Elders are people who are older than you. That's the definition for elders. The blue is just a sentence using the word. She loved hearing stories from her elders. So we're not writing the blue. We're just writing the black because it's asking for the definition. So this is just you getting used to using a glossary and getting to know these 4 words better.